to the Ouattara group, that is the rebels that are taking over in Cote d'Ivoire. I'm going to be offensive to our United Nations. I'm going to be offensive to the French and to our own State Department. And this little girl here, let me introduce to you, if I could, Madam President. Her name is Zagita Marie Rayford. Zagita Marie, Zagita, by the way, is an Ethiopian name that means God's grace. This little girl we found when she's only 2 years old. I happened to be in Ethiopia. She is an orphan, and my daughter Molly, in fact, I should hold this up. These are my 20 kids and grandkids, Madam President. So, and so this is one of them. My daughter Molly had nothing but boys, and so she adopted Zagita Marie. And the reason I bring this up right now is because she came up to me the other day. Now, that little girl, she was 2 days old when we first saw her, almost gone. She's now 10 years old. She reads at college level. She's a brilliant little girl. She came up the other day and she said, Popeye, well, let me explain that. See, I is for Inhofe, that's me. So it's Mama and Popeye, is that all right? Well, right. See, she came and said, Popeye, why is it you do things nobody else would do? And I said, that's why I do them. So I will say to you that Zagita Marie got her answer, and that's the reason I'm talking today. I happen to be very familiar with Africa, and I have been for quite some time on the Senate Armed Services Committee. I think they consider me the point man for Africa. We currently started working with Africa back at 9/11. In 9/11, we made a decision that while the squeeze in terrorism in the Middle East is going down through Djibouti and the Horn of Africa, we need to help the Africans build African brigades, supply them with train and equip, with different programs, help send their officers to the United States to train. And it was a good program. And I sometimes kind of joke around by saying, since I was the only member of the Senate Armed Services Committee who knew where Africa was, I took it on. So anyway, I do have a background in Africa, and for that reason, I'm going to speak for the 4th time in a week, actually the 5th time, on the crisis. Leave it up here if that's, we want to see it, Zagita, yeah. For the 5th time, the crisis in Cote d'Ivoire. Cote d'Ivoire is a West African country. We've been reading about it. You don't read much about it. It's sub-Saharan Africa. Nobody cares about sub-Saharan Africa. They do care about Libya. That's up north, still part of the African continent, but not sub-Saharan Africa. Anyway, the news is reporting that President Gbagbo, that's the seated president, and his wife Simone, were captured yesterday by the French military forces, acting with the rebel forces of Alassane Ouattara. There is a videotape of both President and First Lady in custody. And you can put up the other one right now. According to the BBC and Reuters, that after the UN and the French helicopters repeatedly attacked the presidential palace, French special forces stormed the building with up to 30 French tanks and armored vehicles and took them both from the presidential palace to the Gulf Hotel, killing untold hundreds or thousands of people. We can't tell. This right here, Madam President, is a picture that was taken. This is a helicopter right here, a United Nations helicopter. It was encouraged to be used by the French. The French said, we authorize you. We're going to send our troops in there with you. We're going to do whatever they're doing. This is Abidjan. This is the capital of Cote d'Ivoire. And I happen to, where they're hitting their targets there, that was an area where they have a lot of their ordnance. And I've been there. And I've seen it. They're all scattered, and you have little huts with galvanized steel roofs over them with countless, hundreds and hundreds of people. They're all dead. They have to be. They can't live. And there it is. That's the picture. Put the other one up to give you an idea of what is happening. There it is. It was blown up. They're peppering the entire town. I don't know why. Here I'm a member of the United States Senate, and I can't get even our State Department to look in to see how many people they murdered that night. That was Monday night. A week ago tonight is when that happened. We don't know, but they were murdered. I'm thankful that both the President Gbagbo, and the First Lady, Simone Gbagbo, are still alive, but they've been brutally mutilated. I condemn, however, the use of so-called peacekeeping forces made up of the United Nations and French forces in the attacks on Abidjan and the presidential palace, and these forces that have caused countless deaths in the densely populated city of Abidjan, 4 million people. I hope every president of sub-Saharan Africa is watching right now, because what happened there can happen to any country in sub-Saharan Africa. Africa has 52 countries. I think there are 41 of those are sub-Saharan Africa. The multiple firings of United Nations and French missiles into downtown Abidjan are like firing missiles into downtown New York City. You don't really know how many people are dead. You won't know for a long time. Who knows how many hundreds, if not thousands, of innocent people were killed as a result of the UN and the French bombing just a week ago tonight. Mr. President, this is not peacekeeping, this is war making. This is not the role of the United Nations. And I question why the French are participating in this battle. The African Union has also condemned this foreign military intervention. You know, why don't we listen to Africa? Africa, for so many years, they were used, they were abused, they were by the colonialism. And certainly no one has been worse or more offensive in that than the French have. But they don't listen to Africa. I called up a good friend, President Museveni of Uganda, the other day and asked him what he thought. He has the courage to put something down in writing, which I'm going to read to you, Madam President. This is from President Museveni, and this is an East African country, not West Africa like Cote d'Ivoire. He said, quote, "I have not been happy with the way the United Nations and international community, especially the French, have responded to the events of the post-election Ivory Coast. I desired that it would have been ideal for a thorough investigation into the alleged election rigging, and it be done by a credible and independent body under the African Union leadership and guidance instead of violently forcing Laurent Gbagbo out of power without a hearing. I'm not pleased with the way international community can sanction a situation of bloodbath in the domestic affairs of African countries." You know, I'm just halfway through reading what he said here, and I'm reminded, you know, why aren't we listening to Africans? And he's not the only one. I think every African president would agree with what I'm saying right now. He went on to say, "I would prefer a peaceful intervention by the African Union Committee that would investigate into the matter, give the parties a fair hearing, and come out with a workable recommendation that can promote peace and stability in the region. The recommendation would include the possibility of a peaceful and conciliatory settlement towards a power-sharing deal, as was done in the case of Kenya and Zimbabwe. We all know about that. At this point, I believe," still this is President Museveni of Uganda quoting, "I believe he would be happy to have a team of capable African leaders chosen under the auspices of the African Union to work on a peaceful end to the conflict in Ivory Coast. I believe that the African Union must be given the opportunity to handle the matter in-house. I am, of course, not pleased with the way the UN and the international community has directly thrown their weight in support of Alassane Ouattara and now recognizing him as president." President Museveni from Uganda. I have talked personally to many other presidents, and I could be quoting all of them right now, but essentially that's the statement to which they all agree. And Madam President, I've been informed that this reflects the current sentiments of the African Union too, actually including the current AU Chairman Obiang, who condemned the foreign military intervention in Cote d'Ivoire, saying that, quote, "Africa does not need external influence. Africa must manage its own affairs." That's what the Africans said. That's President Obiang. President Obiang is the president of the African Union. And the Kenyan Prime Minister, Odinga, who happens to be here, and I'll be meeting with him in just a few minutes, was quoted yesterday as saying that President Gbagbo, that's the president who was abused, thrown out of office, has been captured, and I say that he should not be hurt. I have actually already sent word to Mr. Ouattara saying that Gbagbo should not be hurt. If he wants to go out into exile, he should be allowed to go into exile, but he needs to be treated humanely. That's all I'm asking our State Department and the United Nations to do, and they don't do it. I've warned the UN and the French on the floor 4 times in the past week that they would have blood on their hands if they continued supporting the rebel forces of Alassane Ouattara and continued the bombing of the capital of Cote d'Ivoire, Abidjan. And I didn't agree with the immediate ceasefire. Well, that's what's been happening over the last last week, 10 days. I said on April 4th, and I'm quoting myself now on the floor, standing right here at this podium, I said, I think we can avert a real tragedy, something maybe comparable to what happened in 1994 in Rwanda with the genocide. We all remember that. We also remember that we were warned. We weren't warned, but the United Nations was. The Secretary General, we now know, was warned that the genocide was going to take place in 1994 in Rwanda. 800,000 people hacked to death with machetes. And the world stood idly by. Of course, that's sub-Saharan Africa. Nobody cared. I called for a ceasefire in Abidjan. No one responded. This was 8 days ago. You know, I wonder sometimes, why is it nobody cares about sub-Saharan Africa? I remember way back in I think it was 1998, when under President Clinton, they were going to send troops into Kosovo. And the excuse they were using at that time was ethnic cleansing. And I said on this Senate floor, I said, why is it we're all concerned about ethnic cleansing in Kosovo for every one person in Kosovo who's been ethnically cleansed on a given day, 100 in any one country in sub-Saharan Africa has, but nobody cares. Nobody cares about sub-Saharan Africa. Why is there no outcry for these millions of people who are being brutally murdered in other places in the world in sub-Saharan Africa? I have to say this, and I know that I'm repeating what I said in 1998 on the floor. I have to say this, and I know it's very unpopular to say it, but I'm going to quote a guy whose name is Roger Wilkins. He's professor of history and American culture at George Mason University. He said, quote, I think it is pretty clear. U.S. foreign policy is geared to the European-American sensibility, which takes the lives of white people much more seriously than the lives of people who are not white. What's he saying there? I think I know what he's saying. But no one mobilized on behalf of the 500 people who were shot, hacked, and burned to death in a village in eastern Congo, Central Africa, around the same time. No outrage was expressed on behalf of the many other innocents who had been the misfortune of being slain. You know, I read this because I knew this was going to happen. And so it was only 5 days ago that I warned that this was going to happen. So anyway, on April 5th, I said that the Ouattara has tried to deny his involvement in the slaughter of up to 1,000 innocent people. This is April 5th, a little over a week ago. There it is, folks. That town is called Duquay. It's in Cote d'Ivoire. It's a small community. It's the western town of Duquay. His forces I'm talking about Ouattara, took the town earlier last week after the Gbagbo forces had gone. They were already gone. They had to be the Ouattara forces. We know now, Mr. President, that these people were shot, macheted, and burned to death by the Ouattara forces. You may remember me quoting on the floor here just a few days ago a BBC report back last week that quoted the BBC reporter Andrew Harding, who said of the Duquay massacre, this is it now, folks, just a little over a week ago. He said, I spot 4 pigs eating something dark in a charred courtyard, standing by a newly dug mass grave. A UN soldier from Morocco is choking with rage and grief. I ask him if any of the dead that the hogs were eating were children. He nods and begins to sob quietly into his face mask. And I pointed out that The Guardian, a British newspaper, quoted the UN mission which said that, quote, traditional hunters known as Dozos fought alongside Ouattara's forces and took part in killing 330 people in the western town of Duquay, and that Julan Geffa, the deputy head of the Human Rights Division of the United Nations mission in Ivory Coast, blamed at least 220 of the deaths on pro-Ouattara forces. I repeat, this massacre was not caused by Gbagbo forces, but by the Ouattara forces who had taken the town. The Gbagbo forces had left a week earlier. There they are, look at them, mutilated bodies, chewed up, burned. It's in Ouattara, a very small community in the western part of Cote d'Ivoire. I repeat, the massacre was not caused by their forces. I think we all know that. Again, I called, this is last week, for a ceasefire and no one responded, just a week ago. And on April 7th and 8th, I pointed out the United Nations and the French were bombing downtown Abidjan near the presidential palace, where hundreds of young supporters of President Gbagbo had circled the presidential palace, making a human shield from the bombing. This is what they did. All these kids, all they had were baseball bats and 2x4s in a circle surrounding the palace to protect their president, President Gbagbo, and his family of about 17 that were there, and his wife Simone. Now, you saw a minute ago in this one right here that, do you think there's anything left of those kids surrounding the palace? No, they were all mowed down. So he called for, that was on the 7th and 8th. Who knows how many of them were killed? I can't imagine any of them had lived through it. Mr. President, I've also pointed out on April 8th that there were roving death squads. There they are right there, folks. That's Owatra people. The roving death squads who, quote, are disappearing. This is the word they use. They're disappearing supporters of President Gbagbo. That means they're killing them. I called again for an immediate ceasefire. No one responded, not our State Department, not the United Nations, certainly not the French. Mr. President, I also pointed out that I believe massive vote fraud occurred in November 28th in the election in 2010, Côte d'Ivoire presidential election between President Laurent Gbagbo and the rebel leader Alassane Ouattara from up north. That's the Muslim part of Côte d'Ivoire. I submitted evidence in 2 letters to the State Department that showed massive vote fraud allowed Ouattara to steal the election. In one instance, showed that in the first round, we would call this a primary and then a primary runoff. In the first round, in one of the 5 districts in the north, they miscounted, they tabulated them and just added 95,000 additional votes. I documented all of this. If we had 95,000 additional votes in each one of the 5 northern districts, then clearly President Gbagbo won re-election. And in another case, if you look at what they had in the primaries, what we call primaries, in the first round, President Gbagbo got thousands of votes in the northern 5 districts. And when they did the runoff, he got zero votes. That's a statistical impossibility. What did our State Department do? Nothing. I didn't receive it. I finally received a response to my 2 letters saying that they think that this is all fraudulent. They're not going to change their mind. You know, this is sub-Saharan Africa. Do they really care? I can only conclude, Mr. President, that our State Department is engaging in a whitewash of any credible investigation into my allegations. So, Madam President, I call again on the UN, French, and Ouattara forces to halt all the violence, including that being done against President Gbagbo and the First Lady. They will be held responsible if any more harm comes to them. I call for an independent investigation. This is what the Africans want, into all of the atrocities committed by all military forces involved in fighting in Côte d'Ivoire. And I call on the UN, the French, and the Ouattara forces to halt immediately the death squads roving around the streets of Abidjan, disappearing supporters of President Gbagbo. They are led. I got a call from one friend down there that I would certainly not identify. They'd murdered him overnight. And he was talking about how he couldn't go out. He could see bodies, corpses in the street. This was 2 days ago. And they couldn't go out there because they had snipers and they would mow them down. They're led by soldiers of the Ouattara's rebel army, supported by the French and the United Nations, and have killed more than 400 people, in addition to perhaps the thousands killed in the bombing that we've already looked at. So right now I have several friends who give me these reports. They're saying, isn't there anything you could do now? Just if they go in now, after they've killed all these people. And I call upon, again, the United Nations, the French, which I know are not going to do it, and certainly the Ouattara rebels, and our State Department to go in and stop it. We could do it in no time at all. All this concern about Libya and all these things are going, this is just as bad. But nobody cares. Keep in mind, this is sub-Saharan Africa. So the streets are filled with the stench of rotting bodies. Mr. President, I renew my call for hearings before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee into the bombing and killings by the UN, the French, and the Ouattara rebels, and the strong evidence of massive voter fraud in the November presidential election. I appreciate Chairman John Kerry's his willingness to hold such hearings. I look forward to setting a date. The sooner, the better. I've talked to the chairman of the subcommittee, as Chairman Coons and the Ranking Member Isaacson, and they've agreed to have these hearings. I'm anxious to get into this so that all the world can see. Maybe we can stop this from happening again. I don't know. I also suggest that the United States step in to help and examine the possibility of seeking a place of exile for Gbagbo outside of Cote d'Ivoire. The U.S. has performed such a role before when in 1986, under the Reagan administration, Haiti's baby Doc Duvalier was sent into exile in France. So it's happened before. There's nothing wrong. The American government did this before. I'm asking them to do it again. Take these people who are being maybe murdered at this moment. We don't know. We know that they're being tortured, and allow them to go into exile. This could be an important step towards beginning a process of reconciliation that the people of Cote d'Ivoire so dearly deserve. Because this is not about the Gbagbos. It's about the modern day return to French colonial imperialism. And this time, with the help of the United Nations, they were doing this. Here's what my concern is. Cote d'Ivoire has had a hard enough time trying to break free from the yoke of French colonialism. From the days of President Houphouët-Boigny in 1960 through Bidet in 2000, then Gbagbo when he was elected in the year 2000. Now, up to that time, the French has virtually owned all the presidents. They're all right there with France. All you have to do is go through the streets of Abidjan, what streets might be left right now. I doubt if there are many. And you'll see that that's happening. So it's not just the Gbagbos. Any president on the African continent in sub-Saharan Africa should know this could just as well happen to them. And their ministers and their friends. And that's what's happening right now. I'm going to show you something here that I hesitated doing, but this is the happy face of President Gbagbo. This is the face I know. This is the president who's been president since 2000, and he's gone through a lot of these same problems, but he stood up against the French and against Ouattara up in the north. Now he's been captured, and I'll show you what he looks like today. This is 3 days ago. This is today. His face is beat in from the side. He's there. He's being held on this side by someone while they're mashing his face. Then there's Simone, his wife. I happen to know her very well. Go ahead and put her picture up there. I remember in my state of Oklahoma, she's not there anymore, we had really a great congressman named J.C. Watts. He was an African American. I just talked to him today. He was at a hearing that I testified in today. J.C. Watts was an African American, served in the House. And when Simone came at one time, this is Simone Gbagbo, she said, "Would you let me try to get me introduced to J.C. Watts, Congressman Watts?" I said, "Yeah, I'd be glad to do it." And so I didn't know why. I went over and took her to the House of Representatives. We're in the Senate. That was in the House. He was in a committee hearing. He came out, and I said, "I want to introduce you to someone who is the First Lady of Cote d'Ivoire." And she put her arms around him and started crying. And he didn't know why she was crying. And she said to him, "Will you forgive us?" And I said, "Forgive you for what?" J.C. Watts said, "Because we're the ones who sold your brothers into slavery." In the United States of America, people walk around guilty, and they should, about the slavery that they had here. But in Africa, and particularly sub-Saharan Africa and West Africa, where most of the slave trade came from, such as Cote d'Ivoire, they realized that they're the ones who sold their brothers into slavery. And here's Simone begging J.C. Watts to forgive her for selling them into slavery. At the district level, she was elected a member of parliament from her district. She was the leading way for developing a center for the care for orphans in her district. At a national level, Simone Gbagbo, the First Lady, nationwide program for women to get their products to the market. No name for that program is yet found, but that's what their program is. On a continental level, Organization of African First Ladies, she was ahead of it. First Ladies Against HIV/AIDS, a forum created to establish a role of the African First Ladies in dealing with HIV needs for women and children. That's who Simone is. Isn't she pretty? That was a week ago. Let's see what she looks like today. You can't see it now. They have held her and pulled her hair out by the roots. And they went out in the streets and say, "This is the hair of Simone Gbagbo." I don't know what else they did to her. Use your own imagination. Brutally murdered. Now, who are these people? They were the Awatra forces. And do you think we just made that up? Put the next one up. There they are. All of these are identified leaders of the Awatra forces, holding her, and see what they're doing to her, and beating her and pulling her hair out. And that's what's happening today. So I only will say, and now I'll conclude with this, that our State Department's got to wake up. You can't assume that if the United Nations is doing something that it's right. And we have to understand that there is this half of a continent called Sub-Saharan Africa. And those people, their lives are worth just as much as they're worth in Kosovo or Bosnia or the United States or any of the other places where we go and we try to save lives. And so again, I would say to any of our friends in any of the presidents of any of the countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, put that back up. What has happened right here could very well happen to the presidents or the first ladies of your countries. I want to ask three things. Number one, stop the firing that's going on right now. People are being murdered as we speak, Madam President. Stop it. We can do it. We've got the power to do it. Our State Department has to get with the United Nations and make it happen, in spite of what the French might want. And number two, send them into exile. Give them the dignity of living in someplace else in Sub-Saharan Africa so that these people, so that the people of Africa will know. Can you imagine what the people of Cote d'Ivoire will be thinking and doing in the near future if they allow this to go unanswered? That's my appeal to the United States State Department, to the United Nations, and to the French. With that, I yield the floor. I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Conklin.